Hey there, welcome to the third part of Thinking in Fusion with me, Adam from Impact Gamers. This is like a video manual explaining how Clickteam Fusion 2.5 works with both the full edition and the free edition. Currently available from clickteam.com, itch.io and Steam. In this video, we're going to be looking at a really important part of the behind the scenes of a game. When you're playing a game, you'll see the player and the environment. You'll see all the graphics and the artwork, and you may see on screen some counters, some numbers, and some strings with text, but there's likely to be tens or even hundreds of counters and strings operating behind the scenes. Counters and strings are used to keep track of what's happening in-game. It could be your health, it could be your inventory, anything to do with numbers or words. As always, we'll start off with the summaries, so you can just watch the first part of the video, and then we'll go more in depth. So we'll be covering score, lives, counters, strings, then alterable strings and values in depth, the counters, visuals, the expression editor, global strings and counters, then looking at the problems you can have with floating point numbers, that's decimals, and using the timer with counters. Let's kick off the 4-part summary with scores. Scores. Because there's not much to the score and the score object, this summary will pretty much cover everything, so there won't be an in-depth section. The first counter that you're likely to use in Clickteam Fusion is the scores. Since the dawn of gaming, having a score has been a clear way of showing how well you're doing in a game. Scores provide a way to compare yourself to other players, or to show how far you've progressed in a game. They're often linked to rewards, like getting an extra life, and allow games to be competitive. Now, as we've mentioned before in the first video, the score is actually held within the player object. Fusion supports up to a maximum of 4 players for scores, control, and lives. And in the event editor, you can add a condition that if the P1 character collides with a coin, we can then add to the score for player 1. Now that's not enough for the person playing the game, for yourself, because you can't see it. As with many of the counters that you may use in your game, the score counter doesn't start off being actually visible. In the frame editor, if you insert an object, a score object, this is the visual representation of your score. And in the properties toolbar for that object, which is a red tick in the free version and red cogs in the full version, you can choose which player's score it displays. You can also choose if it's visually represented as numbers, which are editable images in the picture editor, or as text, where you can choose a font and it will display in that font and that color. And that's accessible in the properties toolbar text options for that score. Just do make sure that you do have a score object for each player's score, and that it is assigned the correct player in its properties. When positioning the score, position it on the right hand side of the screen, because as it grows, it adds digits to the left. The score starts off with 0, that's its initial value. That can be altered in the application's runtime options, accessed from the properties toolbar. Scroll down and right near the bottom, you can adjust the initial score from there. Score, along with lives that we'll be covering, are quite special because they're global. This means the score is not reset to its initial value between frames. So if you restart the current frame or travel to another frame, the coins reset, but the score doesn't. Your score will keep incrementing. Now this could be a problem if you restart the frame when you die. To resolve this, you'll have to add an action in the event editor, either on when you die or at start of frame, set the score to 0. Otherwise, your score will just keep incrementing. The other thing special about score is it has to be an integer, a whole number. So you can't add a fraction. If you add 1.5 to your score, it will only add 1. It will ignore the fraction. In Clickteam Fusion, they put a kind of fail-safe in so that you can't subtract from your score and get a negative number. So the minimum value is 0, but if you add a negative number to your score, so add -1, it will allow your score to go into the negatives, minus numbers. And the maximum number for a score is 2,174,483,647. And that's because Clickteam Fusion allows 32 bits of information. After that, it goes a bit wonky. Lives is alive! Lives are a common way in games to show how many attempts you can take. Now, lives and health can be interchangeable. It all depends on what you do with the code. But traditionally, if you lose a life, you have to restart the level. And if you lose all your health, then you lose a life. Lives are very similar to the way that scores are handled. The actual control of lives happens within the player object, but is not shown visually to the player unless you add in a lives object. By default, as with the score, when you add a lives object in, that will be the lives for player 1, but this can be changed in the properties toolbar under the settings.
When you position your lives, position them on the left-hand side of the screen because they grow to the right and then downwards. You can click once, wait and then click again to get the resize boxes. Then you can resize the lives, the maximum width available to fill with lives, before going downwards.
Lives is the only counter that allows you to have a repeated image to represent the number. These by default are hearts. You start off with 3 lives. By default, in your application runtime properties, that means there'll be 3 hearts. As with score, you can choose numbers, which are pictures of numbers you can edit in the same way as you would with image, or you can set it as text, and you can change those settings in text options in the properties toolbar. Again, lives can only be integers, whole numbers,
1 point anything.
You'll only add 1 to your live, and lives are restricted from going negative by subtracting 1. They'll stop at 0. But be warned, adding -1 will allow it to go to negative numbers, or if it's images, it will just fill the screen with images. If you're going to have fractions of lives, then you'll need to use a counter, and we'll cover that at a later part in the video at this time code.
As said before, the conditions and actions for lives are held within the player object. And there's 2 different conditions for checking the lives. Compare to player's number of lives. This condition will run constantly when the lives match the condition. What I want to highlight is the condition when number of lives reaches 0. This is a green instantaneous event and will only trigger once for the time that it's true. Just be careful, this specific condition will only run when the lives change. So if the player starts the frame with 0 lives, this condition won't run. You'll have to use compare to player's number of lives, and then you can add a limiting condition from special, which we'll cover in another video.
Now we've done a summary of score and lives, let's have a summary of the counter object. The counter object. Basically, it allows you to have a number and alter it in some way. You'll find it in all objects or in the data category. By default, a counter is set to 0 and is set to be numbers, which are pictorial numbers that you can edit with the picture editor by pressing enter or right-clicking and choosing edit or double-clicking. In the settings for the counter, you can set the initial value, that's the starting value, by default it's 0, a minimum value and a maximum value. And as said before, Clickteam Fusion 2.5 uses 32 bits for its counter, so that gives a maximum of around 2.14 billion and a minimum of negative 2.14 billion. These counter objects are especially useful because they allow you to show things to the user who plays the games or be hidden away to control behind the scenes calculations.
Let's look at the basics for putting events in to do with counters. Under new condition, for a counter, the main option we'll be using is compare the counter to a value. Be careful not to choose compare to fixed value or instance value. These are not to do with the counter's value, but more the object's value, and we'll cover these in a later video when we look at counts and loops. We can then choose a comparison method, equal being the same, different being different to, lower or equal meaning the same as the value or less, lower, greater or equal meaning more than the value or the same, or greater. Then you can either type in a number or get data from the objects below. This is more covered in the expression editor section at this timecode. For complex conditions comparing counters, you can use special, compare two general values, and that way you can do the condition all in this section. But make sure both things you're comparing are values, so you don't end up with an error about mixed strings and values. And the main actions you'll use for a counter are add to counter to increase it by a value, subtract from counter to decrease it by a value, or set counter. This is covered in the expression editor section. We'll cover the different ways that a counter can be shown at this timecode. For advanced counter techniques, we can use something called an array. This is only in the full version though, and we'll look at that in a later video. So moving from numbers with counters, we'll move to characters with strings. Strings! Well, how long is a string? It's around 32,000 characters. And we'll explain that joke later. Where counters are numbers, you can see strings as being letters. But that's not the full picture, because they can be letters and numbers. And that's not the full picture. They can be letters, numbers, and symbols. So, strings are a collection of characters. Not these type of characters, but numbers, letters, and symbols. Things that you can type on the keyboard. Even the spacebar counts as a character. Strings are really useful because in-game you might need some text that changes. So we'll add a new object as a string object. When you do, the default string says text and is set to the Tahoma font size 10. To change the characters in a string, you can either double click on it, or in the properties toolbar under settings, you can edit paragraph 1 by clicking on text and typing it, or if you need to use new lines, click on the 3 dots to get a larger edit box. To change the look of the text, you can do that in the text options in the properties toolbar. From there, you also have options of alignment, so you can horizontally or vertically align the text within its box. This is really useful if you're adding text to the screen and you want it to be in the center, no matter how long the string is. For strings, let's look at the way that we add events. The main condition you might have for a string is comparing it to another string. Now we can't do that from the string object itself. We have to do that through special, compare two general values. Even though it has the word values in it, we can also compare strings in this section. So we can get the alterable string from an object and see if it's equal or different to another one. Only equal and different are useful when comparing strings. And in terms of the actions for strings, we can change the font and the way that the string is displayed. We can change which paragraph it shows. But mainly, we'll normally change the alterable string. This basically is what the string says. This is covered more in depth when we look at the expression editor at this timecode. For advanced string functions, there's things called lists and arrays, and we'll look at those in a later video. Now, if you thought counters and strings were useful, wait till you find out about alterable values and alterable strings, which we'll do now. Alterable values and alterable strings are counters and strings held within an active object. That means you can have lots of the same active object on screen. Inbuilt to them, they will have 26 different counters and strings, and in the 2.5 Plus edition, 260 individual alterable values and alterable strings per active object. Now, even though these are numbered 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 onwards, they're referenced with letters from the alphabet, A to Z, or Z, as you might like to call it, and then for 2.5 Plus edition, AA, AB, AC, and so on. This means two things. Firstly, it means you don't have to add a load of counters. You can use those held within active objects, which makes your frame editor much cleaner to look at. Secondly, and most importantly, it means that each active object has control over its own alterable value.
or alterable string. For example, if we had one counter and one wall, and we said every time we shot the wall, that's a condition of the bullet collision with the wall, we subtract from the counter, and when the counter gets to 0, the wall gets destroyed. Start the counter at 3 shots to the wall is destroyed. But if we add another instance of the wall, it's the same active object, the same rules will apply. As soon as we shoot either of the walls 3 times, both get destroyed. Not what we want. And if we've got 100 walls, we don't want to add 100 counters and then have to add in 100 events. So we can use the alterable values. Now, although you can't set a minimum and a maximum to the alterable value of an active object, you can set its initial value just by going to the Properties toolbar, Values, and setting a new alterable value. And you can name it by double-clicking on the name, and you can set the initial value by clicking on the value. Now in our code, if we say, if the wall is shot, that's a condition of the bullet collision with the wall, it subtracts 1 from its alterable value of health, and change the rule that if the health equals 0, then the wall gets destroyed. That condition in the event is actually referencing a specific wall object, the wall object that has a health of 0. So the action will only apply to that wall object that has a health of 0. And if multiple wall objects have a health of 0, that rule, when it gets checked, will check each wall to see if it has a health of 0. And any wall that has a health of 0 will have the action applied to that specific object. Meaning we can choose any wall to shoot, and as soon as it's shot 3 times, that specific wall is destroyed. And that is the power of alterable values. It allows us to specifically reference an active object with a certain value to have an action applied to it, and it will apply to that object only. Alterable strings are useful as well, but only in more complex games, especially if there's an inventory object that the active object is holding or concealing, or maybe some text that they need to say to the player. So we've looked at numbers and characters. What about flags? What are flags? Let me tell you. Flags. Now, you may know flags from programming by a different term. You may know them as true, false, Boolean, or Boolean, or Boolean. You may know them as switches. You may know them as on and off, 0 and 1. These are values that only have 2 states. They can be off, they can be on. They can be false, they can be true. By default, they're off, which is the equivalent of 0. Flags are extremely useful to keep track of what's happening. Has a player got a power-up? Has a player picked up the key? Is a torch on or off? And flags are the only value that you can toggle, meaning if it's off, it will become on, and if it's on, it will become off. And flags are contained within every active object, the same as alterable values and strings. In the Properties toolbar, under Values. They can be renamed in the same way, by double-clicking on the flag's name to rename it, and you can choose the initial value if it's off or on, unchecked or checked. So in the event editor, I've set up an event saying that for P1, if the torch's flag is on, then make the light visible, and if the torch's light is off, make the light invisible. So to switch between these states, we're going to use the toggle action. And we'll use a condition of a key press. So under condition, mouse and keyboard, the keyboard, upon pressing a key, and I'm going to choose T for torch. Underneath P1, underneath flags, I'm going to choose toggle, the torch flag. Now if I run my application, you'll see the torch is off by default, but by pressing T, it turns on. Pressing T again, it turns off. And by rapidly pressing T, it will turn on and off. But if I hold T, it won't keep flicking because I've done it on key press rather than repeat while key is pressed. We've covered all the basic summaries, so let's go more in depth and look at the counter's visuals. Let's have a look at counter visuals. In your game, you might have different uses for counters. Some counters are used for a percentage, maybe like oxygen left, Some counters might show the degradation of a piece of armour or a weapon, and some quite simply just need to show numbers of how many coins or items you've collected. In the frame editor, once you've inserted a counter object, in the Properties toolbar, under Display you can choose the type. Let's run through these. Hidden means that it's not displayed in the frame editor or in the game, no matter where it's positioned. Numbers, as we've mentioned before, are pictures of numbers, which you can edit. With numbers, you have a choice of having fixed numbers. So if it's a number on a countdown device, you might want to show the zeros. So if you said that it has 2 fixed numbers, when it gets down from 10 to 9, it will go from 10 to 0, 9. Floating point numbers we'll get to when we talk about floats and integers later on at this time code. Vertical bar. Now this is a rectangle that gets smaller the less value you have on your counter. It will only show this rectangle correctly if you've set a minimum value and a maximum value. So if the counter is a percentage, the minimum percent would be 0 and the maximum would be 100. That way, if the counter starts off at initial value of 100, it will be a full bar. At 50, it will be halfway, and at 0, it will be nothing. You can choose the direction of the count, whether it goes upwards or downwards, and its fill type, if it's one colour or a gradient going from one colour to another colour, which is really useful for damage or health, where you might want to represent green as being positive and red as negative. And horizontal bar is the same, apart from this is left and right counting rather than up and down. Animation is very different to images that you have uniquely on the lives object. Animation is an image that shows that frame of the animation depending on the number of the counter. We access it in the same way in the image editor, and we can use this plus button to add another frame. Anything below 0 will just show frame 1. Now, depending on how many frames you have in your animation, those frames will get divided up equally between the minimum and maximum value of your counter. So a quite basic counter with a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 2 could have 3 frames. And frame 1 will get shown when it's 0, frame 2 will get shown when it's 1, and frame 3 will get shown when it's 2. But if you expand the maximum value to be 20, frame 1 will get shown at 0, frame 2 will get shown at 10, and frame 3 will get shown at 20. But this is really useful to pictorially show damage to an item. Text is pretty much exactly the same as numbers, apart from it allows you to choose a font. Be aware that if you're playing the game on a different system to yours, it will need to have that font installed in Windows. So it's quite useful to stick to the web-safe fonts, your Arial, your Tahoma, Helvetica, Verdana, Times New Roman, those sorts of fonts. Alternatively, you can import fonts. If you set your counter to a number, go into the picture editor, select the text tool, choose your colour, and then choose import font. That way, no matter what system you're playing on, it will show as pictures rather than as a font. A thing to mention is that counters don't naturally follow the frame. This means that in scrolling games, they stay in the same section of the screen that they're placed. You can check back about scrolling in this video at this time frame. The expression editor and converting between string and value. Counters with values are simple. We're used to them. 1 plus 1 equals 2. Whereas strings take a little more thought. They can look like numbers, but with a string, 1 plus 1 equals 11. When you're adding to a counter, things are very simple. There's an action of add to counter. There's subtract to counter as well. And adding to counter, you just need to choose the value that you're adding, and it just needs to be a value rather than a string. But setting the counter allows us to use different values or counters to get a final result. Like being the equals button on a calculator. It's as simple as selecting the object or the counter that has the number at the bottom of the expression editor, and then the plus sign with whatever object or number you're adding to. Or if it's held within an object in the game, we can select that object and get it from its alterable values or the counter's value. And Clickteam will be happy to add those two values together. There are also lots of values held within objects in your game. So from the storyboard editor, you can get a value of the width or the height of the frame. From an active object that moves, you can get the value of speed from it. You can get a value of direction. Just by selecting any object at the bottom of the expression editor lets you see what values are available from that object. When a string is written out, it needs to have the inverted commas, the speech marks, the quotation marks, the double quote marks, either side of the characters you're using with that string. But if you add alterable strings or strings from objects together, you can just select them in the expression editor. Just in the expression editor, on any string, you can get its alterable string and add it to another string's alterable string. If we were to add a value to this, we would get the error mixed strings and numbers. And to help us out, Clickteam will show variables in blue, text characters in red, and values in green. If we did want to add a 1 on the end, we'd have to put it in inverted commas, those quotation marks, to make it a red string. When you're combining strings, remember you might need to add a white space. You might need to press spacebar within the inverted commas to include a space. Now, you can also convert values into characters and characters into values. That's a counter into a string and a string into a counter value. So if I want to change a string to say your score is, and then add the score on, I can change its alterable string to say your score is, surrounded by the inverted commas, the speech marks. I can then plus, and I can try and get from player 1 the current value of score. Now, even though the score isn't color-coded in green, it still is a value, not a string. Notice that the blue score doesn't have a $sign at the end. So we get this error message. You can't add a value to a string, you can only add strings to strings. So let's delete that and use a conversion function. And that's just here on the expression editor. It's called $, short for string $. So if we press that, it types out the function, string $, and then within 2 brackets it says enter number here. Well, we're going to get it from the player 1's current value of score. So we click on player 1 and get current value of score. That's now a valid expression. Even though player 1's score is a value, we've converted it to a string and it can add those 2 strings together. Likewise, with counters, if we have a string that holds a number characters, we can convert that back into a value. So for this counter, if I set this counter to be the alterable string of this string, it won't like it. I get told I need to enter a numeric expression. Let's delete that and use the function val to change to a value. So I click on that, it will say enter string here. And now if I right click on the string and choose alterable string, it will say it's a valid expression and allow us to press OK. There are several different functions that allow us to work with strings and separate things out. We have left $, mid $, and right $. When we work with a string, we can just get a number of characters from the left. In this string, I'm going to shorten it so it just shows me the first 3 letters. So I'm going to change the alterable string to the left string of whatever the current alterable string. Then I'll press tab to go along to the next section and enter 3. So I get the first 3 characters. So it starts off as the word elephant, and if I run it, it changes to Ellie, the first 3. Mid-dollar, or mid-string, allows me to choose characters that are anywhere in the string. I could say that 3 characters in, and so it starts off at 0, so the third character of elephant is the P. For 2 characters, using tab to select the next thing, I want to display that. So when I run that, I get the PH, the F. And if I show you for right dollar, for the right string, if I do that and say I want the final 3 letters, so right dollar, the alterable string, 3, if I run that, elephant becomes ant. Now you might not know the length of a string you're working with, but there's a function for that, and that's called len, short for length. I could set this counter to show me the length of a string. I set the counter and use the function len and get the alterable string. And if I run that, I'll end up with 8 because there's 8 letters in elephant. But I can combine len with the left string, mid string and right string to do more advanced calculations. So I could set it, no matter what the length of the word is, to get the second, third and fourth characters from the right. 3 letters before the final letter. You'll find lots online on how to manipulate strings, as every programming language has string manipulation. The other regularly used functions of random, random range, minimum of 2 numbers and maximum of 2 numbers we'll be looking at next session when we look at enemy movement. One thing I want to point out is that to add a new line into a string, there's a special variable called newLine$. And you can find all the string functions in the expression editor under special, under strings. And you can play with those, but we won't be covering them in this video. Next, global and local. Global and local. Global means the value or the string remains the same between frames. Local means that the initial value of the counter or the initial string will be what's shown every time the frame is started. Local values go back to their initial value between frames. You can change local values and strings to be global. As long as that object is on the next frame, those values and those strings will be carried over to the next one. So for a counter, if you select it in the Properties toolbar, under Runtime Options, there's a tick box called Global Object. And by default, if they're the same name and the same type of object, the value will be passed over. So you just need a counter with the same name on the frame you're going to, and that value will be passed over. So here's an example. For a string, it's exactly the same. You select it, go into the Properties toolbar, go into Runtime Options, and choose Global Object. So we can alter these values, go to the next frame, and they remain the same. Now for alterable values and alterable strings and flags, these are held within active objects. So if the active object has an active object on the next frame with the same name, you can make it a global object also. On the active object, under Runtime Options, you can check Global Object. This means that the alterable values will be passed over, the alterable strings will be passed over, and the flags will be passed over into the new frame. Because alterable values, strings and flags aren't visible, Clickteam Fusion has something called the debugger window, allowing us to debug, to find issues, to find bugs. When we run our application, it should be there by default. But if not, if you select your application in the Workspace toolbar, in the settings, at the bottom, you can show debugger and check that box. When you run your application, you can add things to the debugger window. So you can click on the dotted box with the yellow star to add a new object to your debugger. Select your active object and press OK. And now you can see you can open up the alterable values, the strings and the flags to visually see what they are. And this debugger window also works with counters and strings, and with some objects you can manipulate the value and the string during the game just by double clicking on it. Now you may have noticed in the debugger window at the top there's already global values and global strings. Your application itself holds alterable values called global values and alterable strings called global strings. These are extremely useful counters that by default are global throughout the whole game. To get these, in your workspace toolbar, click on your application. In the properties toolbar, go to values, and you can add in global values and global strings. So when there's a value or a string that doesn't apply to a specific object, using these global values and global strings is best to pass information between frames. Just be aware, if you restart your current frame, your score and your lives will remain the same. But global values and global strings do get reset. So instead of the action restart current frame, if I use the action jump to frame, and I can use a calculation and from the storyboard editor get the current frame, so this will always be correct, then the global values and the global strings that we want to maintain stay and don't reset back to their initial values. Integers and floating point numbers, or floating point values, but I'll refer to them as numbers. Now, integers are numbers that are whole numbers, numbers that we're used to in everyday life. 0, 1, 2, 3, even -1, -2. These are whole numbers that are integers. Floating point numbers are numbers that have a decimal point in them. Now, any value or counter, apart from score and lives, can be a floating point number, but it needs to be handled in the correct way in Clickteam. So I'm going to give you an example of handling it incorrectly. Then I'll show you how to do it the correct way. Say if we have a counter. I'm going to set the counter's initial value to 1. Then, in the event editor, I'm going to add a condition that on pressing spacebar, I'm going to set the counter to be whatever the counter is divided by 2. If I run that and press spacebar, 1 should go to 0.5, but it goes to 0 because Clickteam's handling it as an integer. Note the divide sign in programming is a /. As it's handling it as an integer, it's ignoring any of the numbers after the decimal point, any of the fractions. So 0.5 just becomes 0. We can force Clickteam to recognise it as a floating point number just by changing the way we do the division. So rather than just dividing by an integer and keeping all parts of the expression as integers, we're going to divide it by 2.0. That way, Clickteam knows we want to use floating point numbers and will give the answer with a decimal point, because we're using it in our expression. So just by adding that 0.0, if we run our application now, 1 becomes 0.5. This issue of getting an integer when you want a floating point number normally occurs through doing division. So quite often I choose to avoid division. So rather than dividing by 2, I will times by 0.5. With floating point values, in the properties of the counter, you have the option to choose how many significant figures get shown, the number of digits, if it adds zeros to the left to make sure that the number always is the same number of characters. That's all in the properties toolbar for your counter. Hopefully knowing that and being able to use the debugger window to see what counter values are, you can spot if something doesn't get divisible. Because visually showing counters works better with integers, I would always recommend having a counter of a large value. Here's an example of 2 counters. One counter is 10 long, and I say every second minus 1. The other counter is 1000 long, and I say every 100th of a second minus 1. They're both shrinking at the same rate, but the one with the larger range is much smoother, and in effect, it's allowing for a fraction. So a little bit to add in is that if you're using a counter to count with time, the timer only operates as fast as the program updates. So every second, that should be fine. By default, the game aims to run at 60 frames a second. And by frames and the frame rate, I mean how many times it updates the graphics on the screen in a second. So by the time you get to the 60th frame, that will be a second. But if you're using a timer faster than the frames of the game, So if you're saying 1/100th of a second, but your game is only running at 60 frames a second, the events only get checked 60 times a second when running at the full frame rate. Your counter's not going to get up to the full 100 because the code's only been run through 60 times. Therefore, you can either increase the frame rate of your game if you select the application in the properties window under runtime options, you can choose the frame rate, or if you stick to timers that are no less than 2/100ths of a second, because 60 frames a second is about 1.6 hundredth of a second. In reality, this doesn't often cause a problem. You just can't rely on a very fast timer event to be run an exact number of times. For that, you'll need loops, which we'll cover in another video. Hope that's helpful. Get in contact with us if you have any questions. And we'll see you in the next video, where we look at enemy movement and AI. But it's really like pseudo AI, not really AI. Anyway, watch the next video. Bye! See you then.